It's good evening, everybody. Again, this is the third time we meet after the class here in Harvard Graduate School of Education. This evening we are talking about a thing called global educational reform movements and whether it's real or illusion. And we have been reading things related to this. We were reading Michael Fullan's ideas about what he calls wrong drivers in education reform and education policy, and we also investigated a little bit about this thing called global education reform movement, also known as GERM. And I have two students here, Madhu, Mita, and Jonathan, and we're going to have a little conversation about this this topic. Can I ask start with a question?
Sure.
Yeah. Because I often hear people ask me that where is this global education reform movement that I kind of also use as a metaphor or analogy from medicine called GERM, whether it's a real thing or not. And some people claim that this is just a kind of an invention, it doesn't exist, and it's made for make some policies look bad and some other policies look good. But now you have been reading something similar from other authors related to this. What is your view when you, with your own experience and your own knowledge, when you look at the world, what's happening, or what's happening in your countries or this country? Do we have a kind of a global movement that is trying to shape education systems or education in schools in a certain way? Or is it just a kind of a chaos without any order?
Yeah, I would agree that GERM does exist. I think one of the characteristics of these countries is that they're highly responsive and do a lot of short-term investments and a lot of band-aid approaches to problems, trying to fix skill gaps, opportunity gaps, achievement gaps. On the other hand, you have higher performing countries, I think, that have devoted resources to invest in long-term investments and creating sturdier education infrastructures. And so you have lower performing countries that have they're bigger, like America, that are kind of responding a lot, and you have higher performing countries, I think, that have gone their reform route a different way by kind of investing in their education systems and allowing themselves to have longer term social rates of return.
Right. Yeah. What is your view?
I do agree. I think that there were 2 or 3 characteristics that I see that actually play out. One is the role of actually standardization in terms of both test taking and in terms of the curriculum. I think there's a lot of rigidity right now across, I think, different countries in terms of how learning outcomes and student outcomes are being looked at, especially, I think, since PISA has come out, there's a lot of focus around student outcomes. I think there's a huge emphasis around that, and so a lot of countries are scrambling around, okay, so we need to start focusing on that, and they're reworking their curriculums and reworking their learning outcomes, and there's now a shift towards test taking, and I think that's putting a lot of stress on both teachers and the students. Mm-hmm. I also feel that in a lot of countries, including India right now, I think there's also a kind of a parallel movement being created of private entities entering the education space. So you have the public system and you have the private system, which is sort of creating a lot of like competition and choice that you speak about in the GERM as well, which has its own advantages and disadvantages in terms of like widening the gap in terms of like equity. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I do think that those 2 things, and also I think hierarchy of certain subjects over others. Right. There's definitely in Asian countries a hierarchy of math, science over other subjects. So I think GERM is actually definitely prevalent.
Yeah. So if we understand GERM as focus on competition, standardization of teaching and learning, test-based accountability, providing more school choice, privatizing public schools, and running school systems more like you run corporations. Do you think India has this infection of GERM, or?
I think it does. I mean, India, we do have it in terms of, definitely in terms of standardization, we do have it. In terms of test taking, I think that's something we need to move away from in terms of rote skills, in terms of memorization, in terms of how we approach learning. There's a lot of emphasis on memorization right now, and there's certain exams, like a 10th board exam and a 12th board exam, which are given a lot of importance. So a lot of students' life is spent towards preparing for that exam. So which is sort of like standards and benchmarks of it sort of sets your life path for what you do later on in your life. So that's definitely there. That kind of rigidity is there.
Jonathan, you're an expert on education here in the United States. How do you see the?
For me, there's two issues. One is that you have in these germ countries, you have this culture of accountability, and so that allows people to assign blame to each other. It's poverty's fault. It's the parents' fault. It's the union's fault. I think one of the positive trade-offs from that is it allows for more entrepreneurial approaches to education, like charter schools. On the other side, I think you have countries like Finland, Singapore, Alberta that are really kind of fused with this shared responsibility. And so you're not going to see kids being bused to different schools because of the education systems are highly invested in, and it allows, I think, just for more equitable opportunities. And the second thing I see also is in higher performing countries, you have systems that are able to respond more to the shift in work skills demanded now in the new economy. And that's not the case really in a country like America because there is these strings attached to accountability measures like the No Child Left Behind Act and Race to the Top that really kind of emphasize those basic skills you were talking about.
Right. You know, the interesting thing for me with this whole global educational reform movement idea is, first of all, people should not think that it's a theory. It's not a theory. It's just a kind of an idea that helps you to think, is that it wouldn't exist unless we had some examples, some education systems that are so strikingly different than those education systems that are driven by these full-on wrong drivers or germ ideas. And that's why it was about 10 years ago when people started to ask more questions about Finland, how Finland has been, transforming its education system, or what are these drivers behind, when we began to realize that, many of these things that you can find in the Finnish school system, some of them you can find in Canada and some other systems as well, are actually just the opposite of competition and standardization and standardized testing and choice and the strong accountability movement. And so this whole idea of GERM has actually emerged from the opposite. So it's not the kind of a thing that was created because it existed, but it came along because something else was kind of driving against it.
It seems like one of the costs, I guess, in a country like America, in a program like Race to the Top, is that you lose collaboration, and so you have states competing with each other for funds, you have districts competing with each other, and it doesn't allow time for collaboration. And teachers and education leaders, I think, are rightfully skeptical of collaborative efforts.
Yeah, one of the things that there are many interesting details within this global movement, whether it's good or bad. But one of them is, and I want to ask this question from what is your view, is that there are some people now who argue that because of the globalization and the global labor markets that we are facing, that people will be working without borders, that we also should have a global standards. In other words, that every country in India or United States or Finland should basically teach math and science and some other things using the same teaching and learning standards and using the same similar assessments and tests. What do you think about this type of future?
I actually don't agree with that. I think education is actually a very individual process, and it's much harder to actually personalize it and keep it culturally relevant and to base it in the context. And I think with globalization, I think the advantage that we have is that we can expose children to that awareness, have them be more aware of what's happening around in the world, but still keep it very much tuned to their own learning and their own individual growth. And I worry that with standardization, we'll lose that kind of personalization, that innovativeness, that individuality and creativity. So I would veer more towards the more effortful kind of focusing on individuals.
So India should have its own way of teaching.
Yeah, I think all countries. Yeah, I think so. I think that's one of the things that even with PISA and what different countries are trying to do, and I think one of the things that's going wrong with GERM is that they're sort of transferring ideas that say work in Finland or Korea or Alberta and directly adopting in different countries without actually adopting it to the local context and to the local culture, and that does play into the education of that nation and that country. I mean, education is also that is not just skills, it's knowledge, skills, and mindsets, and so all of that plays into it, and you can't ignore that when you're devising those standards.
So should we have global standards, Jonathan?
So it's an interesting question. I think we need to be very honest and pragmatic that there is just a very different economy that's demanding different skills. And so, of course, we want our students to be curious, happy, and love their learning. But I think we also need to acknowledge the fact that there's new skills that are being demanded. And so international benchmarks might be helpful in moving towards that. But certainly we need to just look at, there's a lot of data right now that's showing kind of the elimination of jobs, industries that are no longer existing in a country like America. And so I think we need to just kind of figure out a way to equip those students with the right skills.
Right, right. So what is the, if we keep for a moment, we're still with this kind of a global view of education, and there's a global movement. Are there issues that you see kind of a more problematic, kind of a burning themes or problems in around the world in education that we should be addressing more heavily, or is it just a kind of a general wrong way where many countries are going?
Well, I worry about anxiety in a country like South Korea that's very high performing but also has a high suicide rate, and so even complacency in a country like Finland. I mean, once you're at the top, how do you foresee new changes and challenges? And so one of the trade-offs I think in PISA is this ranking where I think there's now suddenly this anxiety of how do you get to the top, and also how do you respond once you're at the top, kind of how do you maintain your status there?
Yeah. And I think two things. One is around competition again. Within PISA itself, like what is it really promoting? Since we have that ranking system, is it promoting trying to be the best country, or is it better to have some sort of an internal benchmarking system that all sort of countries strive to reach towards? And I think another issue is I think around early childhood. I think there are very few countries that actually been able to, for example, Finland has been able to bring that universal early childhood program, but there's a lot of countries that still haven't been able to maximize that great amount of growth that happens in that phase of child development, and really working towards building a strong public system at that age.
Right. So if you were a president of the United Nations and you would have a power to change one thing in global education, what would you like to address?
I would try to move towards proactive investments like early childhood education, special education services right away, shifting away from this need to respond all the time and trying to be as much proactive in your policies.
Right. How about you?
Definitely early childhood education. That would be top of the list for me. And then moving more towards sort of what they call innovative, sort of empathetic, mindset-related skills, like including those also as part of the standards that we talk about in education.
Right. You know, this is like Sauna in Finland often is. It's a kind of a good atmosphere and good spirit, and we have a conversation about important things. This evening we have been talking about global education or reform movements. I think we have a common kind of acceptance here that it is an issue, and it's affecting many parts of the world, how not only how the policies look like, but how teachers and students experience the world through the classrooms. And you know, my message to students here and teachers around the world is that one of the things you can do is to be more aware of this thing. I think every educator, whether you're a leader or teacher, you need to be aware what's happening around you and what are the forces and interests that are driving education systems. And that's why I think we have this theme, Global Educational Reform Movement, GERM, this evening. So let me thank you, both of you warmly, and let's move on. Thank you.
Thank you.